Good afternoon. I'm going to call to order our meeting today. This is a meeting of the Housing Policy and Development Committee. This is our regularly scheduled meeting of July 11th. I'm Cam Gordon, chair of the committee, and I'm joined by committee members Kevin Reich, Jeremy Schrader, Lisa Bender, and Lisa Goodman, and I believe that Jeremiah Ellison will be arriving shortly. He might be coming a little bit late. We only have 3 items on our agenda today, and they're all discussion items. So we don't have any consent agenda to go through. The first one's going to be a report on gentrification in Minneapolis, and I'll invite folks to get ready and set up for that if they want to right now. And I'll let people know that we're also going to be discussing our housing policy and development work plan, and also we're going to be getting an overview of the Minneapolis 2040 policies that have to do with housing. But first, we're fortunate enough to have the expertise and wisdom of the academic team over at the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs at the University of Minnesota, who did a report and some extensive research on gentrification, both in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And I asked them to come in and give us a little report. This actually will tie in with some work we're going to be looking at probably in a few months, having to do with work we're doing with Policy Link about anti-displacement policy and the network that they have. So I'm going to let you come up and introduce yourselves. I believe we're going to hear from Professor Getz. Welcome.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation. Council members, we're very pleased to be here to talk to you today about the study we did. I'm Ed Getz, the director of KIRA. Dr. Brittany Lewis will also speak. She'll give you the results of our qualitative aspect of our research. And Tony Damiano was central to the analysis as well. And he's got all the answers to any questions that you have, that you may have at this point. So we took a look at gentrification in Minneapolis and in St. Paul. Today we'll focus on Minneapolis. I just want to briefly describe how we did this study. Because of the definition of gentrification, there are some neighborhoods to which this question just doesn't apply, right? So if gentrification is the change in disadvantaged or low wealth communities or disinvested communities, then there's whole portions of the city that it's really sort of inappropriate to say, have they gentrified or not, right? Because they're sort of out of that category. So we have divided the city into essentially 3 different areas. Those places that are not vulnerable to gentrification, those that are vulnerable, and the ones that are vulnerable are simply distinguished by their low incomes and levels of disinvestment that they've experienced. And then a subset of that group is the neighborhoods that are actually experiencing some form of gentrification. So the flow chart looks a little bit like this. We first ask the question, is the neighborhood vulnerable to it? If the answer to that is yes, we follow up with the question, did it actually exhibit the kinds of changes that are consistent with gentrification? Our time period for the analysis was the years 2000 to 2015. And so we applied methodologies that we borrowed from 3 prominent researchers nationally. We didn't want to get bogged down into a debate about definitions of gentrification. We didn't want to be criticized for cooking the books by creating our own definition of gentrification. So we used 3 different gentrification measures, and we decided that where at least 2 of them agreed, then we would identify this as a neighborhood that was either vulnerable to gentrification or actually has gentrified. So the peach-colored census tracts that you see highlighted are the neighborhoods that are the focus of our study. These are the ones that could potentially gentrify given their census data characteristics in the year 2000. And you can see, of course, it's mostly near south and near north neighborhoods. And you can see that in Minneapolis, almost half of the neighborhoods met that definition of could potentially gentrify, that they were coming from a starting point that was worth looking at. So the second question then that we asked is, which of these neighborhoods actually?
If I could interrupt, I think we have a question.
Yes.
I know we don't want to get in the pattern of interrupting too much, but could you just give us a general sense of the kinds of characteristics you looked at, like income level and what that would be like? And did you include race or not?
Right. So again, we used 3 different measures. So one of the measures did have race as one of the as one of the baseline factors, but generally it was income, percentage of the population that has a bachelor's degree, and then housing market characteristics. All right. So
Can I just ask a follow-up
Yes.
question then? So is it most of the reason why the area that is gray, or in the other slide, whatever color it was, that way because the incomes are already too high or the housing is already too
Correct.
expensive? Okay.
Correct. So we just sort of excluded them from, because they had a starting point that was sort of
The gentry already were occupying that area, so to speak, or
Yeah.
something? Okay.
something like that. Right. So the map you have in front of you then shows the light and dark shades of blue. The dark shades of blue are the neighborhoods that actually changed in the ways that are consistent with gentrification between 2000 and 2015. The light blues are those neighborhoods that were vulnerable to gentrification, but actually did not gentrify, at least according to the measures that we used.
And this is a really good sign because now we have a third question. Councilmember Goodman.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair.
No,
Well, either I talked to Councilmember Bender, or I just asked my question out loud, so I thought I would do that. I hate to bring this up, and it's not for anything other than potential ignorance, but it seems like the word gentrification is bad. And I guess I would use I look at your map and what's happening in Elliott Park, and I would say that people who live in Elliott Park, including low-income renters, would not say what's happening in Elliott Park is bad. The neighborhood was 95% rental, and almost that amount affordable rental. And many of those folks are on their board and they feel like they don't get good services, and they felt they needed to bring in some condos in order to rebalance the neighborhood to be able to have more services genuinely associated with people who have more money to spend on services. So it sounds like you're using the word gentrification to say something that's necessarily bad. I'm wondering if you could clarify, is it in your mind, is gentrification in a neighborhood like that a bad thing?
You want me to cut straight to that? So we talk about this in our report, that gentrification is this contested term, and that some people see gentrification as much needed improvement in neighborhoods that have not experienced that for long periods of time, while other people look at that and see a threat to their continued residence in a neighborhood, but the potential for cultural displacement, et cetera. What we try to do in the study is to not make a normative argument. We have adopted 3 definitions of what other researchers have identified as neighborhood change that's consistent with gentrification. We've identified where that's occurring in Minneapolis. And then part of Brittany's work was to do interviews. We did over 80 interviews with public officials, with neighborhood leaders, with neighborhood residents, with business people, to get at their perceptions at what is going on in the neighborhoods. And we came across evidence of the kind of disagreements that you're talking about.
So you do then basically think gentrification as a blanket statement would be something that would be bad?
No.
That's not necessarily what I heard.
Well, that's what I heard you saying. I heard you basically
I
say.
thought I tried to say the opposite. I tried to say that we identified gentrification as kind of a set of changes in the market, in the housing market, and in the socioeconomic status, demographics of a neighborhood. And the question of who benefits from that, who thinks it's good and who thinks it's bad, that's the politics of gentrification. And that wasn't exactly the focus of our study.
Whether or not it's good or bad, just whether or not that's happening.
Whether or not it's happening and how people perceive it at the neighborhood level.
And so maybe later we'll hear a little bit more about
We
what
will,
some of the
absolutely.
residents feel as
That's
good or
correct.
bad about what's happening.
That's correct.
Thank you.
That's correct. All right. So you can see in Minneapolis that close to 40% of the neighborhoods that were vulnerable to gentrification actually did change in ways that were consistent with gentrification. So the question is, what was happening in those neighborhoods? You look at the first graph and you see that actually in the aggregate, there was no sort of change in the percentage African Americans in these neighborhoods, but that actually hides a good deal of variation from one census tract to the other. We found neighborhoods that actually lost significant percentage of African Americans, and we saw other neighborhoods where no change occurred. In the aggregate, the average is no change. Share of the population with a college degree went up. It went up significantly in gentrifying neighborhoods. It didn't in the non-gentrifying neighborhoods, and that was consistent across all of the neighborhoods that we identified as gentrifying. Housing market changes were also consistent. We saw significantly higher increases in median rents and a great deal more more dramatic increase in home values in gentrifying neighborhoods compared to those that were vulnerable but did not gentrify. And then finally, and these are interesting, we actually found that the median household income did not increase, even in gentrifying neighborhoods. And in fact, we saw that the poverty rate was increasing, even in gentrifying neighborhoods. Now, this runs sort of counter to what people would expect when they think about gentrifying neighborhoods. Doesn't that mean that the place is getting more affluent, et cetera? So we took a closer look at those neighborhoods where the medians were not moving up. In fact, were moving downward. And what we found that explains these two graphs is that we found gentrifying neighborhoods were actually increasing in inequality. So you actually had more poverty in those neighborhoods. So let me talk you through this graph. The horizontal axis is household income. So on the far left are those households who are very low income. They're at the first 10 percentile, the lowest 10 percentile of the income distribution. And then as you go to the right, you describe higher income residents, okay? And then the vertical axis is the change in the income of those households over the 15 years of our study, all right? And what you see are three different lines. The one line is those high income neighborhoods at the beginning, the ones that we didn't really study. And then the other two lines are the vulnerable neighborhoods that did not gentrify and the vulnerable neighborhoods that did gentrify. And what you see is a couple of things. First of all, lower income people across all three different types of neighborhoods saw a decline in their income over this past 15 years, real income. You even saw in neighborhoods that were vulnerable to gentrification but did not gentrify, you even saw a decline in income at the top end of the distribution. It was only in existing high income neighborhoods and gentrifying neighborhoods that you saw both a decline in income at the bottom end and an increase in income at the top end of the income distribution. So you're seeing a greater level of inequality in these neighborhoods, and that's explaining how you can see gentrification in a census tract at the same time that you see concentrations of poverty or even increasing poverty.
So I would just want to ask a question. So I'm making an assumption here when you talk about number of bachelor degree makes a change, the household income makes changes, that there's actually different people coming into the neighborhood and people are leaving and coming in, but do we know that for sure?
We don't know that for sure. Right.
Okay.
We don't have individual level data. We were using census level data. So
Because it would be a different story if we thought, oh, those same households are getting educated and income's increasing and that, but we're
it's
not.
a different dynamic.
We're not trying to say that, but we're not exactly sure.
That's correct.
Okay. Councilmember Schrader?
Yeah, just to follow up on that. So I'm assuming you don't have data on asking a question, who gentrifies? You know, who is moving into those neighborhoods? What's that change? Is it a life stage, or is it people in different life stages and any of that? That would be for another study.
Right.
Okay.
Right. We don't have individual level data.
Oh, perfect. Thanks.
Or we didn't use it. We don't have it. So I want to sort of give Brittany enough time. This is just a slide that just shows we saw lots of different variation in gentrifying neighborhoods. Some places where percent Black was increasing, some places, Willard Hay and Bryant, where there were significant declines. Same with poverty, same with income. This is just to show that gentrification doesn't look the same in every census tract. I think different kinds of dynamics can be taking place. What we did see that was the same are these three factors. Across all gentrifying tracts, you did see an increase in the percentage with bachelor's degree, increase in home values, and increase in rents. And so I will cede the floor to Brittany, who will quickly talk you through the qualitative analysis.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Councilmember Gordon, for inviting us today. So I was in charge of the qualitative aspect of the project. So before I start, I always make sure to share with folks Cura's value of qualitative research. We value shared meaning making with local community members. Their day-to-day realities and experiences matter a great deal to us. There's importance of showing a dynamic or negotiated set of realities. How we feel and live a reality matters just as much as what our data points tell us on any given map. And for us, it's a deeper understanding of why and how major development and investment decisions impacts people the way that it does, especially considering that there is an unsaid social and psychological distancing that often takes place between those making decisions and those everyday people most affected by changes as they are trying to understand what is happening with them at the table or not. So I want to make sure that we impart that value to you all before I begin. And here's a bit of a chart about our interest in investing in multiple ways of knowing. There are cultural ways of knowing. Mainstream knowledges often dictate certain spaces more than others. So we want to make sure that people's voices and how they're experiencing things come to the center of this conversation just as much as the amazing data work that the quantitative team did here today. So this is a map that highlights which areas that came from the quantitative indexes that we looked at, that we chose to focus in on more closely to do qualitative interviews. So I'll kind of explain a little bit about the structure of our qualitative interviews. So we did 30 initial interviews with public officials or neighborhood leaders. And from those interviews, we did snowball sampling, and we did 58 additional interviews across all clusters. And we made sure to get a representative sample of homeowners, business owners, renters, and long-term residents. And this just gives you a general sense of who it is we talk to. Okay. The first thing I'll do is talk about the narrative commonalities. And Dr. Getz kind of alluded to this a little bit prior to me coming up here, that gentrification geographically actually does look different across any given kind of area. And the Twin Cities is a great example of that. So often we all know the common or classic discourses of gentrification. In my interviews, 100% of the participants identified increasing financial costs, but folks did it in different ways. So for instance, here's a quote: "If I look at my customers, you used to be able to get 1 or 2 bedroom apartments here at $850 or a duplex. And now you're probably looking at $1,600 to $2,200. The average new built condo is $1,100 and double is probably $22. That's absolutely insane." I also want to share that in these interviews, we would place actual maps in front of folks of the actual area that we were discussing. And we allowed them to write on these maps if it ever felt so relevant. And folks would literally write, "I lived here, I paid this. I lived here, I paid that." They would talk about, the restaurants they would frequent and the things that they would do in their communities. It was a visual aid that a lot of folks utilized. Changes in demographics. 88% of our participants identified increases of whiteness in their neighborhood, as well as 53% used this synonymously with higher incomes and more professionals. 67% identified a younger population moving into community. Here's a quote: "So as much as I like to see good white people running around and enjoying their community, you know what I'm saying, enjoying their amenities, those amenities should not just come with those people." And the dogs are different too. They went from pit bulls to chihuahuas. 72% of our respondents noted a fear of physical displacement by citing the inevitability of displacement. This matters so much. So often in this debate of gentrification, policymakers in particular are saying, prove to us that physical displacement is happening, without wanting to talk at all about cultural, political, or other forms of displacement that cause people to make decisions about where they live and how they interact with people. Fears and anxieties matter just as much about how people are making decisions in community. My main concern is affordable housing, because we don't have affordable housing. We're going to eventually be pushed out. All people of color, not just Black people, everybody, or poor people, period. The sentiment that was shared. 67% of our participants identified new businesses or business development as uncharacteristic of neighborhood as a sign of gentrification. But I really want to focus a bit on the narrative distinctions within North, Northeast, and the South clusters. So in North, and here's a map of the actual cluster area that we did these interviews in, 3 major themes came out frequently: a lack of community-based ownership, a new wave of development neglecting resident voices, and historic designation being used as a tool of gentrification. These are kind of the main frameworks that folks talked about what they saw happening. So in this quote, I won't read all these quotes because they're fairly lengthy. Folks talked about having to go into community meetings and lay claim to both their history and time in a space, mostly because they feel like those outside developers or interests would come in and do things with them or to them rather than with them, right? And they would talk about this frequently. Historic designation, the Homewood neighborhood and the Willard Hay, there was a number of folks that talked about this debate that took place. I'm sure you're all well aware of the historic designation debate, which at this point has been tabled. The debate between, defining this place as historically designated, maintaining architectural standards that some folks can't or won't be able to, living on fixed incomes, etc. In short, folks talked about it as a potential gated community. If that takes place, there'll be a different kind of attention that goes to this neighborhood, and those that have stayed in the neighborhood and sustained it will be pushed out. Northeast, I would argue unequivocally that this place is gentrifying. What 3 frames have come up? The commodification of the arts, creative placemaking bring new types of makers, and the raw artist is unable to afford live workspace, forcing men into the inner and outer ring suburbs. I'm sure we all are fairly aware that Northeast has a historic arts designation, and we can look across the country and see the correlation between arts and gentrification. And in short, folks use this Art of World event as the signification of what has happened to Northeast. What went for an event for a handful of, fine artists to sell to a few to sustain themselves has come to a nationwide event that is more about the beer and the band. It's Mardi Gras, okay? Everyone is a maker. I found this to be extremely compelling. Brewers are makers now. And if you can mass produce your work from the tech industry to the digital industry, you're more competitive in a way that those folks that came to Northeast for refuge can no longer maintain themselves. Leasing costs, live workspace is hard to maintain in these spaces. South Minneapolis. So South Minneapolis had a number of different neighborhoods within the cluster. And if there are some questions about specific areas, I can be more than willing to answer those questions. The phrases or the commonality that came out of these interviews, the fear of uptowning, new businesses don't match historic needs, and a lack of resources available for established community-driven businesses. So the fear of uptowning, folks use uptowning as a verb. If you're from the Twin Cities, assuming most folks live here, they have a sense of, where is uptown and what's happened to uptown, right? From, historic mom and pop cultural enclave has come to big top shops, right? And they use this way to describe the fears and what they're seeing. The $20 candle shop that I know has moved across here. There was a notation of a coffee shop, I believe, called the Blue Ox, and folks talked about interacting with that former owner and their unwillingness, right, to think about their business model and what the community needed. They didn't last long, and someone else came in. So this kind of reiterates this new business is not matching, right, the nature of the community. Powderhorn is such an artsy area. I also interacted with business owners, both queer and of color, trying to provide services specific to those communities find themselves priced out through leasing, unable to maintain their commitments to providing low-cost services to those communities that live within there because of what's happening, and little resources in the city to help those historic, small, community-driven established businesses maintain themselves. I think two things I'd like to give us kind of takeaways from this. We're not San Francisco. We're not New York. The way in which gentrification is taking place here geographically is different. Across these 5 cluster areas and the 3 cluster areas in Minneapolis specifically, I'd argue I heard some very distinct realities taking place in Northeast that don't necessarily align with what's happening in North. And that is a reality based on its historic disinvestment, right? Who was manufactured to be contained in certain communities, and how that has created the realities we have today. We have to acknowledge that. Those distinctions matter. I think so our approaches should kind of acknowledge those distinctions. All right. So here's just kind of some summary for us all to think more deeply about, and we're all available for some questions afterward. Gentrification is happening in many parts of the city. As Dr. Getz noted in his initial kind of address with you all, the purpose of this project was not to say if it was good or bad. It was to assess it was happening. It takes different forms across different neighborhoods. We found that to be extremely compelling as we analyzed the data and we met with folks. We found different ways that gentrification and the characteristics were taking place based on the arts designation of the economy in certain areas, historic designation, or business development on certain corridors really shaped how people were experiencing this differently across the city. Gentrification is occurring even in neighborhoods where poverty is increasing. This is about inequality, falling incomes at the low end, rising incomes at the top. Again, what I think is an amazing contribution that the quantitative component of this project has made to the conversation of gentrification. How can you have poverty and high incomes in the same place? We should think real critically about that. Displacement is not just physical. We found evidence of cultural, political, and social displacement. We've had folks share with us some cultural centers that have been displaced as a result of gentrification. And a lot of that has to do with increasing leasing costs. We've also heard of some fairly unscrupulous practices from some folks holding onto businesses intentionally and not investing in them, and how that's affected business owners and local community members. Residents were often frustrated by a declining sense of belonging and ownership. This part to me really stood out for me in the interviews. Belonging and ownership matters. The citizens that you all represent need to feel like they belong. They need to feel like they have a stake in the communities in which they're invested, because then they'll put investments in the communities themselves. I think that matters. I think displacement fears often dictate how neighbors interact with one another. Oh, I've heard some interesting stories from neighbors who are identifying the gentry and how they interact with them, right? And or the political moves, they argue that some that have political power are utilizing against historic residents in the community who've been asking for certain things but couldn't get anyone to make a move. This creates a feeling of distrust. It influences people to make decisions about where they move, how they build relationships and coalitions, right? That I think impacts city process in many ways. And I think things that our electeds and others should think deeply about. Thank you so much. If there are any questions, we are more than willing to answer.
I think there might be a couple questions. I know that I have some, but Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mine might be more of a comment, but I wanted to thank you for taking on the work of defining and putting data behind a word that is very charged. And I think it's really helpful. I've stopped talking about gentrification in Ward 10. And now when I look at your map, most of my ward in the quantitative side, at least at the map I'm looking at, in my interpretation of it, didn't meet the criteria for gentrification. But I know that in my ward of 80% renters, their lived experience is to be in deep fear of displacement from their community. And I know also that the most vulnerable of my constituents are most at risk and are most affected by that fear. And that includes my lowest income constituents, and particularly constituents have any kind of vulnerability around, their records or their immigration status or anything that makes them more vulnerable to intimidation or creates challenges in finding housing. So I really appreciate the kind of both approaches to the work. And I just wanted to say that I think as policymakers, I don't know how my colleagues feel, but I think this is really informative. And I also feel like what I'm taking from it is these pieces that are translating into the policy work we're doing, which is how are we stabilizing housing, particularly for vulnerable renters in the city, and that piece of it. How are we building wealth in neighborhoods for low-income people who live in place? So maybe in the future, we'll see census tracts where income is rising and education level is rising, and that will be a good thing because it is benefiting the people who live in that place. And I know a number of our colleagues are working on that approach. So I think this gives us one measure and a lot of takeaways, but I also think about it myself in a bigger policy context around community wealth building, particularly in communities of color that have seen incomes drop dramatically, around housing stability that is an issue even in neighborhoods that don't meet this criteria. So that was my comment in reflection on the presentation. I'm really grateful for you for being here today.
Thank you. I was curious if you had an explanation for the growth in income disparity. I mean, my assumption there would be that some middle or lower middle income people are being pushed out of the neighborhood somehow, but the people who are deeper in poverty aren't because they have nowhere to go. But that's just kind of a extrapolating and jumping to conclusions. Do you have any theories about that?
Well, there are only theories at this point. I mean, we don't. It would have taken a different study and a sort of different type of data to really get at that particular question. So, I mean, I think it's important to note that the sort of the secular trend was a decline in income, in real income over this 15-year period. And that you really saw only incomes at the high end and only in certain neighborhoods increase over this period of time. And I think that's sort of, broadly consistent with changes taking place in the American economy over the last 20, 30 years, where people's real earnings have not kept up with inflation. They have not kept up with costs, except for folks who are benefiting from information technologies and changes in the economy. So I think we're seeing that. We can't really say anything about who's moving in, who's moving out. We can only point to overall patterns that are consistent with benefits being seen by only a portion of the population.
I guess I'm also curious if in any of the interviews people talked about friends or neighbors who had left, because I think we heard some about the fear of displacement, and I know we didn't. You're saying the study didn't track people to see that they left or came in, but were there anecdotes about who's left and that? Maybe you could share a little of that.
Yeah, 100%. Folks definitely shared those stories. I can recall a number of artists in particular in Northeast talking about they're having to go further into the suburbs to find live workspace. Another artist continues to have to downsize space because of the cost of the square foot per space. I can recall particularly, and probably in a St. Paul example, which kind of St. Paul in the South cluster had some narratives about the lack of folks accepting Section 8 and having to choose between moving. I think Rosemont came up a number of times for whatever reason. Folks choosing to move further out to spaces like Rosemont, you'd get, they say, a washer and dryer, you get a yard, but you're far away from your job and transportation. There are folks that are couch hopping, right? Just to stay in the central city. Folks that have leases that have lots more people than should be living there, because they can't move further out because they don't have the systems of support, whether it's family to help with their children or what have you. And so they're doing those things to kind of support one another. They're unapologetic about those tactics. That's very, very common. Other folks, this didn't come up as much in Minneapolis, which kind of surprised me, but who can afford tax credit housing was a huge conversation with a lot of our St. Paul residents. I mean, if you look at the local AMI and the regional AMI who can afford it, yes, the young professional can move in and afford it, but the local resident who is historic to that space cannot if you compare the median incomes of both. And then we mapped out a number of charts to illustrate that is certainly a fact. I think no one here can deny that reality. So we're talking about affordable, but what is affordable, right? And I have to be really honest about ourselves about what that means. And this data is very stark. And I think that's happening across the city. So then you're forcing your constituents to make kind of survival decisions, right? That might not fall in line with our laws or what some of our ethics might tell us. Right? This is what fear and anxiety does.
So I did think of one response that I neglected to mention. It's true when we look at income and we look at education and we see changes over time, we're not sure whether that's new people or existing people moving in. But the one place where we can see actual movement of people out of these neighborhoods is the race variable. We saw in a number of neighborhoods a significant decline in the number and the percentage of African Americans. So that's where we could look at the data that we had, which was not individual, but still come to a conclusion that actually we did see some folks really moving out. The change wasn't about how they changed themselves in terms of income or education.
Well, that's a good point. I also, so looking at all this information, and it made me wonder if gentrification is as useful a term as it could be, partly because the story is very different in every neighborhood. We had some of those outlier neighborhoods you talked about, and Elliott Park was one of them in your study, where actually the home values were decreasing, but gentrification was identified there, and like we talk about displacement, gentrifying isn't really measuring that. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how useful is this as a term to help us judge policy? Because what we would love to have is something like gentrification and say, decide if it's good or bad, and then measure it happening and seeing what we can do to influence it happening.
I think your point is well taken. I think the term has reached that point where it generates more heat than light, right? It's not quite clear, especially when you have, as we found, different processes taking place. So, I mean, I think it's perhaps time to look more carefully at the specific changes that are taking place in neighborhoods rather than just using the label gentrification. I think it obscures a great deal. I will say that oftentimes, this question of whether it's good or bad is not one that is easily answered, because it tends to be good for some people and bad for a different group of people. And so it's hard to sort of figure out what the balance sheet should look like and when it's on the whole good or on the whole bad, right? So that's another reality of gentrification that makes it complicated.
We also get worried about, and I don't think that the gentrification of commercial space, and just hearing the stories about the artist space. And we've certainly, those of us who've been around Minneapolis for a long time, remember the old warehouse district and all the music and the bands and the dance people struggling in the really, really super affordable spaces you could get there. And that's completely gone now. Some probably did go to Northeast for a while and find some space, and now they're searching elsewhere. But I think that happens with other commercial space in this city too, which is also a concern. I think we also hear the stories about Portland or San Francisco or somewhere, and we think, well, we don't want to be that. And so curious if you've seen other cities and anything they've done to deal with this issue that you think is promising where we might look?
Well, so the last part of our report and the thing that is keeping it from being published at this moment is a policy section, a recommendation section. There are a number of sort of toolboxes for gentrification that exist in various locations, three really very well-known ones. We thought that it wouldn't be a great contribution on our part to replicate that. What we're going to do instead is take a look at efforts that are occurring here locally and to sort of take a look at them, what they're trying to achieve, and to see how that matches with the phenomenon that we've tried to identify here. So that we're still in the process of working on, and we hope that will be useful when we finish it.
And are you also connected to the All In Cities Anti-Displacement Policy Network?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Are you also connected to the All In Cities Anti-Displacement Policy Network? I think is the official name.
Yes.
And that we are as well. So I think there's 3 council members who are involved in that actually, and so I think that's a good table to help bring these ideas to. Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just had another thought in reflecting on the map of the quantitative study and a couple of things about that, particularly since we have the comp plan update coming up. One is that you really see a pattern, at least in the neighborhoods that I'm more familiar with in Ward 10 and nearby, of seeing gentrification identified in those neighborhoods that have the most new development. And they are around public amenities like new transit lines or the Midtown Greenway. So I think there's maybe a couple of things to take from that. One is we should probably be thoughtful as a city and a region about how we are planning for future, like when we're putting in a public amenity, to understand how that's affecting property values, home prices, commercial rent prices, and if we are intentional and committed to maintaining affordability, having a plan in place to mitigate those impacts. The second piece is if we had an inclusionary housing requirement in these places where we've seen a lot of new development, that could have helped some of these numbers. You wouldn't have seen such a huge shift. It still might have been a shift. So I think that there are policy lessons that we can start to draw, and hopefully you'll help us, even before your report is done, understand how this data can help us guide some of these policy discussions that are happening right now. But those were just a couple that sort of jumped out to me as I was just thinking here now.
Yeah, I wanted to make a quick comment about two things that you were said. The first thing, I would argue whether it's through, equity toolkits or equity analysis that you can use before you even introduce a policy, right? Which I understand, and those, even the word equity, throughout different forms of government, it's only a word until you actually give it power. So I think what you're describing is exactly what should be taking place. Any development that takes place across the country should be assessing its impact in the community it goes in, and there should be tools that assess the equity of that. And I believe those tools actually do exist here. I've seen some come across. So I'm not quite sure how often folks are using it, when, where, and how, and when people decide to use it. But I think that those discussions and debates should always already, be happening. And the question of like the good or bad narrative, I feel like the reason we're uncomfortable with that conversation is because it implicates, we are all implicated in it. I mean, that's why it's a hard discussion to have, irrespective of where you stand. Everyone I interviewed wants to benefit from these changes. No one I interviewed doesn't believe in new development, upgrading amenities. Not one person doesn't want those things. The reason we're having such a hard time is because we're implicating some people who have more power to decide what communities look like. And I think if we're going to do anything positive, both citizens and our policymakers need to own that discussion in an intentional way.
Thank you. I think that makes a nice closing. I don't see any other questions or comments. So really appreciate that, and we'll look forward to the next phase of this as it comes forward. And I'll just, I mean, there's certainly a lot more information available online for folks. Even though the report isn't published, there's a pretty large presentation that's available. We also now have the PowerPoint presentation on the city's website as well, and some links to some other things, like I think right over to Cura. So the only action we have to take on this is express our gratitude, and then we'll vote on receiving and filing the report. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? The motion carries then. And now we'll move on to our second item on the agenda, which is the Housing Policy Development Committee Work Plan. This is mostly an idea of mine, but we put some work into it, so I think I'll let Ms. Brennan just briefly explain what this is.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. I'm Andrea Brennan, Director of the Housing Policy and Development Division of Cpad. This is another receive and file item before you, requested receive and file, which identifies the work plan of housing-related work that is currently underway that will come before this committee. I believe there's one exception of an item on here that is related to affordable housing, but will be reviewed by the Economic Development and Regulatory Services Committee. But every other item will come back to this committee in some fashion. And so we wanted to put all of these work items in one place, put them before you so that with a sort of estimated timeline when we think they will be coming forward, so that you have a sense of the work that is currently underway, how it relates to how each item relates to one another, and just so that you know that there's a lot of work going on. What I wanted to call out specifically, just related to the other things that are on the agenda today, one, the study that Cura did is on this work plan is the and that Chair Gordon, you mentioned the All-in Cities Anti-Displacement Policy Network. Councilmember Ellison and Council Vice President Jenkins participate in this committee, and we have had Cura's participation in this because we see them as a really strong and important data partner in this work. And some of the discussion that is happening in that committee in terms of potential work items include things such as like an impact statement analysis that Councilmember Bender mentioned about looking at what may be potential benefits of investment and how can any potential displacement pressures be mitigated. Other issues are things such as reframing how we talk about different parts of our city in terms of looking at demographic data such as poverty rates and rates of white versus people of color population. So reframing some of that narrative. Also looking at, really who is benefiting from investment that's happening in community. So those are some of the, so the Anti-Displacement Policy Network is one of the headings under here, but it's envisioned that a lot of sort of policy work is going to be discussed. And a lot of that work is also identified separately as listed here. So just to name a couple, there's a fair amount of work that's happening in preserving the naturally occurring affordable housing. About half of low-income renters in the city, more than half of low-income renters in the city actually live in non-subsidized housing, rental housing. So, the need to preserve the affordability and the quality of that housing is a really important anti-displacement strategy. Another related item, some policy work that's on here that also is related to anti-displacement is advance notice of sale and renter protections, ordinance introductions that have been made that we'll be working on and bringing forward. So a lot of this work is very related to the work that Cura has presented today. So I just wanted to point that out. And then also the next thing on the agenda is a presentation on the housing elements of the comprehensive plan. And So that's also housing policy work that's underway here. That's listed on the work plan, and related to that is research and work that we'll be bringing forward related to inclusionary housing that we see as going sort of in tandem with the comp plan. So I would be happy to respond to any specific questions about anything on this proposed work plan. If you have any.
I don't see any questions right now. My plan actually is to move to approve this, and I just want to encourage people to take a look at it. What we did was we tried to collect all the work that the council has brought, the expectation on our committee, not necessarily all the work that's going to be coming through in the normal approvals that will have to happen in land sales and other things that's coming from Cpad, but some of that, but more the council work. So if you look at it, it's divided up into ordinance introductions, staff directions, and policy decisions. I also thought it would really be helpful for us to have some kind of time frame, so they're divided up into what quarters we're expecting to act on them. And my assumption is this is kind of a deal we're making with ourselves as a committee and with our professional staff to assist us. These are reasonable expectations that we have. And when the next big thing gets brought in, we're going to have to see how that fits in with what's going on here. And if we feel there is a need, we can move something way up as a top priority. We'll have that authority, but this will give us a kind of a grounding. This is actually something I think Zoning and Planning Committee used to do years ago too, and I think it helped with their work and it helped kind of manage it. And it will certainly help me as committee chair feel like I have a better grasp of everything that's going on and all the plates that are spinning and all the work that's going on. And so I appreciate folks taking a look at it. I think it also will help us be a little more transparent and accountable to the public, because now this is also available on our agenda. It's online. This is going to be a document that we said we're going to do. And of course, maybe not of course, but there will be some times probably when Q3 morphs into Q4 when we're actually getting it done, and some of these things might go into next year. But on the plan right now, this is a plan for what's going to get done this year mostly. I think everything ends, by fourth quarter, so good luck, team. I think we can do it. So with that pep talk, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, that motion carries. Thank you so much. And that will bring us to our third item, which is the receiving and filing an overview of the 2040 plan, which actually has quite a bit of policy having to do with housing in it. I don't know if anybody's noticed that yet, but it does. And so we're going to get a little bit of overview now, and we can have any discussion that we want and however much we want. So welcome, Ms. Worthington.
Thank you, Chair Gordon, council members. Some of you have heard my introductory remarks previously. I would make them again for the record. The city has benefited from the involvement of over 150 staff people across the enterprise in the development of the draft of the comp plan, which has been out for community comment since March 22nd. And we're nearing the end of that 100-day comment period. So we thought it would be a good idea to come around and talk with committees about the specific elements of the comp plan that relate to your policy work. The draft has a small number of what I would call true policies when it comes to land use and the statutory requirements of the comp plan. And then it has a much larger number of policy statements, which are related to the work that you will be doing well into the future, and especially the work around housing, as you've heard from the previous two presenters. But these policy statements are interconnected with some of the systems elements within a comprehensive plan that are required by statute and certainly related to land use controls. And so we'd like to try and illustrate for you where those linkages exist. We have some of these interconnected policies to talk with you about today, certainly not the entire list, but we would like to just highlight a couple. I also just wanted to mention, I think on the heels of the Kira presentation, which was extremely interesting, and our staff has been following that work very closely. I think it speaks to the need for something we have suggested on a number of occasions with you, either individually or in committee, that we would really like to see better longitudinal data metrics that can drive policymaking over a period of time. And some of the analysis that Kira has done is very interesting to us in terms of trying to measure how the city changes over time. Not necessarily whether that change is good or bad, but how it is changing and what are some of the regulatory and policy-driven things that you can do as a city council to help shape that and manage that kind of growth. And I think that's really a great kind of foundation to the work of the comprehensive plan. That's really what this document is about. And I just would also say that we've been asked a number of times to comment on gentrification as a concept. And I too have some discomfort with the word in that I think it has become defined as something negative. And as I've pointed out to residents in all parts of the city, there's really a fine line between investment and displacement. And that is the space that I think we all understand to be gentrification. And so this issue of displacement has come up on a number of occasions as we've talked to residents throughout the city. Most recently, we were in North Minneapolis, and we heard very loudly and clearly from residents who are also business owners in that area that they're concerned about commercial displacement. And so that's a major issue in addition to housing displacement. So I just wanted to mention that. I think it was the time was right to just let you know that we're hearing a lot of those comments and taking all of that feedback into consideration as we think about a final draft. So I'm going to ask Brian Schaefer to come up and walk you through this presentation, and then we'll stand for questions. Thank you.
Councilmember Goodman may have a question beforehand.
Mr. Chair, Ms. Worthington. So I'm glad to hear you say that, because I've been at a number of meetings where there is a feeling that smaller individual homes, some on existing commercial corridors, some on future but not existing commercial corridors, will be torn down for high-rise redevelopment, or somebody's 4 stories, somebody's 16 story. I live downtown. I don't think 4 stories is a high-rise, but I understand some people do. That in and of itself is going to cause displacement. It was pretty much the reason why the historic district wasn't put into place. So I just want to make sure I heard correctly that the planning department is acknowledging that there are many fears about this massive upzoning, and displacement is but one of them, but it's also one of them that we think will affect our affordable housing strategy.
I think it could affect it in a positive way or a negative way, depending on how we regulate it. Yes, and we are hearing those concerns very clearly, and we share those concerns.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Chair Gordon, council members. I'm going to spend a touch on a couple points briefly and just kind of move forward, and we'll open up for conversation and discussion. Obviously, we have all the staff I think that we need to have for that conversation today. I want to just remind you as we move forward that we have 14 goals that the previous council adopted. Many of you were on that council. 2 of these goals really kind of are fundamental to some of the conversations we're having today. One about reduced disparities, and one about affordable and accessible housing. Again, all the policies in the comprehensive plan have been developed to implement these 14 goals and the action steps of those policies to move that forward. So I just want to just kind of ground us in that those 2 exist, and those are the things that we're moving forward. Unlike other past comprehensive plans, this is the first time we actually have goals that have been set out. And these goals really do focus on racial equity and meeting climate change and affordable housing. We've shown you a lot of data, both in the comprehensive plan on the website. We've shown you a lot of data through housing study sessions last August, even this cycle, or in this recent year as well. And I don't want to spend a ton of time on data because I think we've spent a lot of time on it, but I do want to bring up one chart to kind of talk a little bit more about how we're looking at how we're looking at the households of Minneapolis and how we're kind of seeing this and moving forward with the comp plan. Again, the comp plan is really late about undoing some of the past wrongs and kind of creating new opportunities to undo that past and bring forward more housing choice, more housing stability, and more opportunity. This chart is something that we haven't published yet, but we will include in the future here. And it's a breakdown of Minneapolis's households by both their income and tenure level across the city, and also by whether it's cost burden or not. This is Chaz data from HUD. Its most recent data is 2014, so this most recent data we have. And I'll just kind of give you a little chance to look at the graph, or the chart. But the gray areas or the gray bars are not cost burden. So those are households that are not cost burden. They're spending less than 30% of their income on housing. They're doing relatively fine. That's obviously a relative statement. The blue portions are households that are cost burdened. So these are households spending 30% of their income or more on housing. And then there's the orange portions, and those are severely cost burdened. So these are households spending 50% or more of their income. So half their income is going towards housing on an annual or monthly basis. So when you look at this, I often call this a bookend, the bookends of Minneapolis. If you look at it, the largest concentration of property or of households we have in the city, 47,000 households, to be exact, are in this lowest category under owner-occupied and have an income of greater or equal to 100% or greater than 100% AMI. So that's 47,000 households. The city has about 180-some thousand households total. The next group, the next largest portion of population in households we have in Minneapolis are renter-occupied households that make less than 30% of their median income. These are, for a family of four, that's $28,000. And I think Dr. Lewis mentioned before affordability at both by the AMI levels, but also by someone's income and how much they can spend. There's a lot more definition below 30%, so we can't just pretend that's the only bar. But what we see here is that this upper portion is really what we're trying to concentrate on in some of the policy conversations, what we've heard a lot about in the community engagement we've been doing on the comp plan with this recent draft, and in the years past as we've been doing this work. So you see that there's 19,000 households that are just spending over 50% of their income on housing that are in that lowest income of 30% band. So a severe need there and interest in how do we help address those situations. And while this isn't broken down by race, we do know a lot of things about our population. We know that we are a majority renter population. We know that under 30% AMI is majority people of color in Minneapolis, a majority renter. They're disproportionately both. We know that their incomes have fallen. So we know that Black and African American households have seen a 40% reduction in income. I believe Chair Gordon had asked that of Professor Getz and Dr. Lewis and Tony earlier about their work, but we know that about our populations. And we know that over 50% of Black and African American households and 45% of American Indian households are cost burden, paying more than 30% of their income on housing. So what we're looking at is when we start talking about both how the plan went forwards equity, but also how we need to really start focusing our resources, we start talking about this portion of the graph chart up here, these households less than 30% AMI. Obviously, there's need across all, not trying to subject that there isn't, but this helps demonstrate some of that, some of those experiences.
So do we have a specific policy statement that says what we're going to do about the 30% and under?
You teed me up for the next slide.
Okay. and if, I don't know, if Councilmember Goodman also has a question, maybe she wants to ask before moving ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's not really a question. It's like, I don't need to have a master's in planning to know that people who are at 30% or lower of the MMI are cost burdened. Mm-hmm. You're not telling us this like as teaching us something, right?
It's just illustration.
I mean,
I don't think
I feel a little bit pandered to. I mean, of course we know that people who are under 50% and really at 30% are severely cost burdened. But, you know, like tearing down starter homes and adding a bunch of density is not going to get to that 30% either. And that's the population we're looking at, which we have to partner with public housing and the federal government and all of the other entities, the homeless services, Hennepin County, to be able to deal with those issues. So I don't want to conflate density with solving this problem. I mean, we know, even if you look at it, actually, the owner-occupied, really poor people do less bad than the people who are really poor in rental. So what that says to me is home ownership as a strategy for wealth creation and stability is a good thing.
Chair Gordon, Councilmember Brennan, I agree with you, but I have I'll let Andrea take that, or you want me to run it out? Let you know I'm here. First, the comp plan, we do not actually state in the comprehensive plan that we think density is a strategy to increase affordability, especially at these levels. I understand that statement out there, and I understand there's elements of that and how that's moved forward. So I want to make sure that that's clear. I think also we build a lot of, we do have policies in the draft plan to talk about wealth building strategies, whether they be for single family home, whether they be for other types of housing opportunities as well. And with that, I think I can hand it off to Andrea to talk a little bit more.
Oh, I just wanted to Mr. Chair, members of the committee, Councilmember Goodman, wanted to make just a point about Councilmember Goodman's specific question, and that, we really believe that this information is really important for the public to see and for the public to understand, because when you look at the majority, like the largest group of population in Minneapolis are owners. I mean, and it does depend on whether owners do itemized deductions on their taxes, but to the extent that they do, all of them are receiving some kind of housing subsidy. And compare that to the second largest group of households in the city of Minneapolis, and those are renters making less than 30% of area median income, and only about a quarter of them receive a housing subsidy. And so we also thought that this displaying the data in this way is really important education for the public, for them to understand sort of when we get to the place where we talk about policy language, and then we get to the strategies that we're identifying under those policy goals, why. And we felt like that was important for, not for those that are very familiar with it, like council members and policymakers, but the public generally.
And I just want to note that I'm probably not as smart as many other council members, but I found this graph actually useful. And I think the fact that we are counting how many people and we can compare it into the other categories makes it useful too. So I appreciate seeing this here. And I'm not so sure that we actually drill down enough with the policies in this first draft of the comp plan is how are we going to focus on the poorest or the lowest income populations of the city to make sure that we're providing enough housing for them. And so I think that's a section that might get beefed up between the 22nd of July and September. So, but let's see what we've got right now.
Chair Gordon, Commissioners, yes, let's see what we have and talk about drilling down. We've heard a lot of that in the public about going farther and drilling down deeper into this. One of the things we work with is that we do recognize this is a 10-year document that guides our policy decisions. And as Heather mentioned earlier in her presentation, that these policies aren't necessarily all the things that need to be guided by for our regulatory requirements for a comp plan, but part of that ability to make sure that all the dots are connected and we think about this holistically. So what we are saying in the action steps around affordable housing and housing preservation and production is really want to expand the tools and resources. We know right now that the city has lots of tools. We have low-income housing tax credits, we have affordable housing trust fund, we have home ownership programs and federal and state dollars. But we need to be really intentional how we build on these resources and how that money is spent. We also know that we need more money to do the work that we're doing. And you've seen the mayor's proposal to invest $50 million. Council President Bender brought up inclusionary zoning earlier during the CURA presentation. So again, it's going back to all these other things, and we need to start looking at different ways of doing that. So I'll kind of touch on that today, but right now the plan does talk about prioritizing the needs of those at or below 30% AMI while expanding our tools to provide at 30, 50, and 80%. Again, going deeper is always a place we can go, but we want to make sure we're not outlining specific programs for a 10-year plan where we need to be a little bit more nimble to address some of the housing market. And I'll talk a little bit about how we intend to do that a little bit, and we can obviously bring in Housing Director Andrea Brennan back up to talk more. Another big element that we've talked about is housing stability. So in addition to just producing and preserving units, obviously preserving units helps with stability. We also must focus on supporting renters and homeowners to make sure they have and keep and retain stable housing. So tenant protections are an important component, and there are a number of actions that council has already taken on this, including conduct and premises, advance notice of sale, renter protection ordinance that's being planned. You just outlined a work plan for the rest of this year that identifies some of those tools. So again, we have this larger policy framework that we're proposing, but a lot of the work is being done at a programmatic level and ordinance level and regulatory level as we move forward. And as you know, and as we talked about earlier, Chair Gordon, we are part of the Anti-Displacement Policy Network and are taking active steps in preventing displacement and learning more through that network and ways that we can deploy those new tools and think about that. And as we start thinking about that, it's another element of how do we move forward with kind of this idea of comprehensive investments. Heather was standing up here before and mentioned 150 staff across all the different teams. The housing research team had staff from Hennepin County, the Minneapolis Public Schools, Regulatory Services, Public Health, IGR. So we had a large cross set of that. And one of the things we really came up with is this idea of prioritizing investments where programs are helping at a comprehensive level. So these are looking at social services, other tools that we're also doing, whether it's regulatory, using Shorebreak Services Department, whether it's Hennepin County tools that are more on the social side of things. How can we start packaging those tools and making sure that we are all stacking that work to move forward and be more comprehensive, knowing that housing stability is much more than just providing housing that is affordable or safe, that there's a lot of things that go around that add to instability. Another thing just to mention is, in action step E here, you see we talk about areas of concentrated poverty. It's an example of, through that anti-displacement policy network, we're looking at developing a better term for that, using a better term that doesn't necessarily bring down, but kind of is a little bit more, talks about the opportunity with that as well. And not as a negative label, which we've had conversations about in the past. So this is kind of another example of this ongoing work that we're doing as this arc of the plan is actually out getting reviewed, and all of our staff are working diligently along with all of you on the dais and all the rest of your colleagues. We're trying to move policy and regulations forward and advance us farther than it currently is. One of the ways that we talked about going forward, and really, again, going to the fact that this is a 10-year plan, and a lot of the housing issues are quick and nimble, and we have to be kind of quick and nimble with those, and developing a new policy and program can take a while, is this idea of having innovative housing strategies. We have a policy around that. But really the thought is that we need to be able to do things more quickly. So the 4D program is a great example that you have seen this earlier in the spring, where housing went through and developed a quick prototype for that 4D program, a small number of units that could be qualified to see how that can do in piloting that. And this is kind of the process that working with Andrea and others in the housing policy and development, really talking about how can we do this in a more of a methodological way, but also how can we start deploying tools faster, because housing markets are changing quicker than our policies and ordinances can move. So again, this idea of just kind of a prototyping kind of program, see if they find an issue, an opportunity that we need to work on, research and do the concept development of that quickly, then release a pilot program, so like the 4D program. And just like the 4D program, there's an evaluation process that's involved. And if that program is working well, we can scale that up and move that forward. So what this is just an illustration to say that this is how we want to kind of move some of those work items forward to help be more nimble and advance a lot of the policy and go deeper and help drill down to some of those specific strategies and innovations. And to the points earlier is that one of the largest elements of housing stability and housing policy isn't just purely having housing units and having places where you can live, but it's also making sure that we have the human development side of that. So really looking at some of the economic components of that, looking at education, economic access to technology, healthy pre-K, healthy youth development, human capital and trained workforces. These are a series of policies we have in the plan that are about helping support and build the residents of Minneapolis up. How can we help them from an educational perspective? How can we make sure that we reduce those disparities that we see both, especially at the pre-K levels that come up really quickly with lower income households? How can we move that forward and really start addressing some of the work that you've seen, probably the CURA work that talked about shrinking cities, their work where people could live in different parts of the city during periods of time and income dropping. One of the big components of housing affordability is declining incomes. In fact, again, Black and Native Americans having a 40% reduction in their household income since 2000 is a perfect example of where we need to do other work than just provide housing to help build up our residents of the city. So getting to land use, we do also believe that there's a land.
Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had a quick comment on the policy piece before you switched to the land use side. I just want to say, we had a presentation like this on the Transportation and Public Works Committee that I sit on. I know there have been others that and so I think actually in the housing policies, we've done a comparatively good job of baking in race equity commitments into the policy language, maybe compared to other parts of the plan. So I noted that the transportation policies, I think, could actually use some beefing up on the language side. I think there's a couple pieces of this that are unique to the housing and land use. The first is that I think these policies that are really high level as they probably should be in a comprehensive plan, but there's a lot of interest in getting to the specifics because affordable housing is such an important piece of the plan and just so important in the city right now. And so I think whether it's in the plan or not, I think what we're all hearing and staff as well is our need to be more specific about how we're going to do these higher level pieces probably faster on the housing than maybe in other elements of the plan. And the second thing I wanted to note, and this will help maybe translate into the land use thing that you're about to go into, because we're talking about regulating land use instead of, for example, guiding our own transportation spending, there's this interim period between when the plan is adopted and when we might implement any zoning changes or other things to implement our housing policy, where we're going to have a plan in place to deal with the implications of changing land use policy without having those pieces completely in place, because they probably won't all be. So in February of 2019, a developer comes with a proposal for a rezoning that is now supported by the land use guidance in our plan, and maybe we don't have our inclusionary zoning ordinance totally adopted. Like, we'll need to have strategies in place in that interim period. So I just wanted to say, I know staff is cognizant of that, and I know all of us council members are hearing that and have identified that as a need, either for the next version of the plan, but certainly in the implementation steps that are going to come with it. So feel free to
Chair Gordon,
add.
Councilmember Bender, I'm glad you raised that. And I just wanted to just jump in and just say that I think what we'll be bringing to you with the final draft will be a kind of draft schedule of events in terms of 2019 and 20, just so that we can start thinking about what those regulatory and policy making efforts will look like over the period of several years. So thank you.
So since we took a short pause, could we go back to the innovative housing type slide? And I really appreciated seeing this come in, and there's been lots of discussion about what innovations and what things we could do to catch up. And I noticed that some things are called out in the plan and other things aren't. So I just wanted to raise, I think, some already existing efforts to innovate that we did. So we have recently, we did accessory dwelling units, and I think that was an innovative housing type that we've utilized. And I think we all thought we'd get to maybe review that and expand it or see where it would go next. Amendments are probably coming, whether or not it's in the comp plan or not. Another thing that we did as a council is we created something called intentional communities. And this is a very innovative kind of program, and it's creeping out there a little bit. It's a little bit like co-housing, I think, which does get, or cooperative housing that is listed in the plan, but intentional communities aren't named. Maybe they could be named. There's also something else we did that hasn't been realized yet. We created a new category of housing called emergency housing, where it's you could short-term but more permanent housing that could be up to 30 days, and you don't need a rental license, and it could be provided similar to the overnight shelters, but very different because you can actually be there for a while. I think those are really interesting ideas. Then there's things on the national scene that you might hear about, which is the tiny homes, and then there's also the prefab manufactured homes, and how would that work? And we actually run into a lot of trouble here in terms of how accessory dwelling units don't need this, but most houses need a full-fledged basement just to operate and function. So accessory dwelling units don't. But if you were going to put in a house without anything, water pipes underground, maybe we don't need that. I don't know. But you certainly can't do a mobile home. A foundation. There you go, a foundation. Yeah. So we don't allow mobile homes, which I'm not necessarily saying we should, but anywhere in Minneapolis either. I also, so I'm wondering. The idea is there still is room, and we're emphasizing intentional communities and accessory dwelling units as an innovation step or as something in here to work on. But go ahead. And
Chair Gordon, I mean, I think that's a great place to bring up that. And I think that's one of the things we're trying to work through. So I really appreciate those comments. I think I know the rest of the staff do too, of how can we start thinking about innovative and housing types. And one of the things we laughed about when we started writing innovative housing types and thinking about it is we're talking about single room occupancy. We're talking about some of the accessory dwelling units. We're talking about co-housing and co-ops, things we're not seeing necessarily happening a whole lot of in Minneapolis, especially around some of that. And laughing that those aren't really new. They're ages and ages old. And we've talking about bringing that back and looking at that. And this is an example where the narrative kind of sets up some conversation, but the action steps are really more just a continuous work item that we would need to continue to do, and to be nimble to move forward on that. Again, in a place where we can talk about refining those going farther and getting that feedback. Again, this is a plan, not up here to defend a plan, but as much as to explain what's in there, and we have a draft and we have lots of room to make some more improvements.
And I appreciate that. And I don't know whether there could be more clear action steps about some of those things.
Yeah.
I did also want to just say that I really appreciated that we're broaching the topic of single room occupancy or rooming houses. I actually think that is something that we could probably regulate effectively, and the ones that existed before they were banned, or before we didn't allow new ones, I guess they're not actually banned because they have a right to keep operating, but if they were to shut down for a year, they'd lose those rights, which is too bad. And there's also some people who want to come in and take over some of those and upgrade some of those rooming houses and see that they could actually financially do it on a really modest rent, because it's much cheaper than supportive housing. And a lot of supportive housing kind of operates the same way, but it's regulated differently, and but it's also much more expensive because people need a lot more support. So I'm glad to see that coming forward. I think that could offer some real potential. I also do think it's a bit of a landmine, so to speak. I don't know what kind of the right way to describe that is. So I think it's something we have to talk about carefully, and we have to, just like I probably did, talk about how we're going to be able to regulate it effectively, and we're going to make sure that we can do that as we allow more of it. But I think it offers a lot of potential as transition for some people, but also maybe as a permanent housing for others.
Yeah, Chair Gordon, that is the idea of how we have to implement these. When they're good ideas, implementation, especially from a regulation, is a huge element of the work that Cpad and Reg Services and other parts of this enterprise do.
I'll try to talk less so you can get through this. You guys feel free to talk more.
All right. This would actually, I only have 2 more slides, so we can move forward at the speed that you want to move forward. Again, talking about, Heather was up here saying we have just a handful of actual land use regulatory or policy that became that kind of the ordinance or create the regulatory requirements we have to move for housing or move forward. And access to housing is one of those policies. This is about the actual access, physical access, not financial or other amounts. So this really just relates to the land use maps. And it's how we kind of organize the built form and land use maps, you've seen and heard about immensely. But one of the first action steps is to allow multifamily on public transit routes and higher density stations along our metro stations. So this is something that we've seen before. It's not a variation really from anything that we've done in existing past policy. In fact, it's kind of consistent, or incredibly consistent. Secondly, in neighborhood interiors that contain a mix of housing types from single family homes to apartments, allow new housing within that range. And that does get to a little bit something different. Or in some parts of the city, we have our current comprehensive plan has a certain set of policies around urban neighborhood and doesn't really get down to development intensity. And we have so many regulations that are somewhat consistent and somewhat inconsistent with some of that. And what we're trying to do here is be much more consistent. And there's housing types that we have downzoned and not allowed to continue to have, especially in those areas. And then I've done a process to kind of reconsider if we can think about that. So that's informed that built form map, especially those interior 2 and interior 3 categories. And then in neighborhood interiors farthest from downtown today that contain primarily single family homes, we want to achieve a greater supply and diversity. We know that we lack housing options in many of those areas. I'm an Armitage resident, and I know how many one bedroom apartments are in there. And I think there's very few. We have the data to talk about that and provide that more detail on it. But what we're saying is to allow up to 4 units within, I'll just read it to be precise here, achieve greater housing supply and diversity by allowing small scale residential structures on traditional sized city lots with up to 4 dwelling units, including single family duplexes, threeplexes, 4 units, or 3 units, 4 units, and accessory dwelling unit building types. So what we're saying here again is we're looking at what the existing footprint is. We allow for a certain home today that has an FAR of 0.5, height of 32 feet to the peak. We're saying in those, the way that we regulate and think about new homes, how can we allow for more than 1 unit in that existing footprint of what we'd allow for new? So that's what we're trying to say with and achieve with that action step. And obviously that's more a conversation we can probably dig in today, but also dig in tomorrow too at the Zoning and Planning Committee meeting. But this is a way we're talking about achieving options where we don't see a lot of options. You've seen how we've talked about that in the plan around past practices with zoning and FHA policy. And this is one of our ways to try to create those new options, both to forward equity conversations, but also really forward much more of a housing diversity conversation where there is lack of options for people to age in their community. Moving on to just next steps is really talking, we're July 22nd is the end of the public comment period. I'm sure you're aware of that. We'll have a new draft out, a revised draft. It'll be a red line draft, so we'll be able to see that by the end of September. So we'll be able to track those changes and make sure everybody can see how we've incorporated comments and how those changes have been made. And then in late October, we'll have a public hearing at the City Planning Commission, and we plan to be in front of the City Council for review by December, so we can move it on to the Met Council by the end of December. So that's kind of our process going forward. Obviously, we have our full staff here today to help answer questions if there's any more comments or questions.
Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One of the things that's been brought up to me is that there's not going to be a public hearing in front of the City Council. I think that is a mistake. In fact, I think that there are concerns from people where they feel like they're not being heard. They're coming to community meetings. Some council members are there, others are not. Some staff are there, others are not. And that we have a process for having public hearings at the city, either through committee of the whole or the zoning and planning committee. And I would just urge us to think about not pushing that responsibility off on the planning commission, where there's only one council member who I'm sure is getting a mass majority of the complaints because he serves on the planning commission. So I do think that we have to have something in front of the council, and leadership can figure out what that is. But I just thought I'd mention this since it came up in this in the next steps.
I agree too, and maybe that we could even do more. I think there is going to be a need to do some more community engagement, whether it's more led by the council in the council process after the next draft comes out. And I know that Councilmember Schrader also wants to comment.
Yes, no, I certainly agree that we should do something with the full council. I do push back on being in front of an individual committee due to kind of the workload and the fact that I think this is going to be a bigger dialogue. What I would add to, I think in addition to just having the council, I've been having community meetings. Like I'm on my 10th one right now, and I think that's the best way to have a dialogue. This is a very charged document in a lot of ways. I don't see that going down, and I think the way to get actual constructive comments, and I've had very good conversations, passionate but good conversations with my constituents, and it's a different format than we would have at a more of a just public hearing. So I think it's a good addition, but I would also want to see more outreach by all of my colleagues.
Mr. Chair, I agree with Councilmember Schrader. I do note, though, and I will note this for you today, for tomorrow, it's the exact same people who serve on this committee who serve on zoning and planning. Mm-hmm. So this is the group probably that has some heightened level of awareness of both of these issues. There is no exception. I think it's exactly the same. Mm-hmm. So it potentially, this is the group of people that have this heightened level of interest. And I do think what's happening, because I can see the email that's coming into me, is that a lot of it's being copied to Councilmember Schrader because of his position on the Planning Commission, and people are fearful there isn't going to be a chance for public out loud comment in front of us. And so it sounds like the chair of this committee and zoning and planning and the council president, chairs of all these people are chairs of major committees, want to have the public have an opportunity to comment on the plan in general. I think after the next draft is released, we might have a lot less high emotion, or we might have more high emotion. I don't know, but I'm assuming since the planning director is telling people that there will be changes, and I believe there will be changes, that you can sift out a good amount of concern.
Did you want to comment?
I just want to add to that. I think regardless of if there's changes or not, and I expect there to be changes, I would like to see something set in advance just for the clarity. I think people are the unsurety is what's hurting this. My hope for a plan like this is to be able to say what city we can be, and we haven't achieved that type of conversation. We've really been dealing with people's fears, and I think we owe the city some clarity about here's what the process is going to be to hopefully achieve that goal of saying where we want to be in 2040.
Council President Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Since we're talking about process, I think it has been really great to have these presentations at each committee to highlight, the policies related to public health and in the environment and energy, that the conversation we had at Transportation and Public Works. We had in the past, Councilmember Reich and I were the two council members who served on the steering committee last term. And there had been some conversations then about even bringing different elements of the plan through the council, through those different policy committees that touch these different topic areas. And I think in part because some of our policies and plans are more developed than others as a city. I mean, we have really robust transportation system plans that this comprehensive plan is going to build on, but it's not going to be any kind of big deviation or departure. We have a climate action plan that set a lot of the groundwork for, I think, the energy and environment systems that are in this, although I think this will go farther. So anyway, I think the policy areas are at different levels of development. And so I just want to throw that out there. I mean, I think it's something that myself and Councilman Reich and Schrader or others should follow up on with staff, is to see what's the most transparent way we can bring this through the council that gives people a chance to feel heard, and for council members to weigh in on those policy areas where they're most interested and not drive all of you crazy too. So yeah.
I'd certainly be open to having another presentation kind of like this on the next draft, so we understood the housing policy part. So I'm open to that idea, and I hear you saying that, and I think it might be doable. Did you want to weigh in on some of these thoughts?
Chair Gordon, council members, only to say we await your direction in terms of a hearing before the committee of the whole. We're happy to accommodate whatever process you'd like to have. And then I would also just say, pretty consistently from day one, I've said it's a draft. We're really looking for people's comments and thoughtful, constructive feedback on it. That's certainly what we're continuing to ask for. In that same spirit, as you note, the document will change, probably somewhat substantially, just in terms of it becoming a more final document. But there is much work to be done, and I think it would be helpful for you to, as you have in the past, adopt some kind of roadmap for how you will implement the plan going forward. And so we will make that part of what we bring to you along with the final draft, just so that you can get a sense of where we're headed on this. It is complex, so thank you.
And I had one question that might have to do with the roadmap, and it's maybe something more about the zoning. But you, on the last slide, you showed a picture of the 3 segments or the whatever. And a question I've been getting, and I think I understand the answer, but people are wondering, what's going to happen with the residential, commercial, industrial zoning in those categories? Are they turning into internal 1, internal 2, internal 3, and transit, et cetera? Are they actually going to be changed? Or are we just going to try to fit the old definitions into the comp plan groupings?
Chair Gordon, council members, there will likely need to be some rezoning language that changes, as well as the rezoning, the actual guidance of the land uses. So to make it clear and more usable for lay people. So I think that some of the zoning designations are quite old in terms of how they describe land uses. For instance, industrial zoning. Industrially zoned land is not really industrial like heavy pollution producing or very heavy industry related land uses any longer. It's a different kind of land use today. So we'd like to have the language in the zoning code describe that more appropriately. So there will need to be some changes there as we look at rezoning. The city has not been rezoned for, is it 99? So we did like an interim rezoning in 99. So quite a while. Yeah. And so I think there's some discussion about how deeply we need to rezone, but that's something we'll come to clarity around as we walk around a final draft and better understand where we all sit with it. So
what I'm hearing is we could hold on to our zoning and commercial zoning, perhaps, and we could rename industrial. We don't know for sure.
We don't know for sure at this point.
Okay.
We'll get back to you on that. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you. Do you have any final comments? I don't see any other questions. So I'm ready to make a motion to receive and file this excellent report, and thanks committee members for the good discussion. Any opposed, say no. That motion carries. And with that, our business is concluded and this meeting is adjourned.